Henry VIII, born in 1491, ascended to the throne of England in 1509 after the death of his father, Henry VII. His early reign was marked by charisma, intelligence, and a desire to be remembered as a noble king. But beneath the surface, Henry was a ruler who would later become infamous for his ruthless consolidation of power and a religious revolution that left a trail of blood in its wake. The seeds of brutality were sown as early as his first marriage. His union with Catherine of Aragon became the trigger for a religious and political upheaval that would cost thousands their lives. Henry's desire for a male heir and the failure of Catherine to provide one led him to seek annulment. When the Pope refused to grant it, Henry took the unprecedented step of breaking away from the Roman Catholic Church. In 1534, he declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, a move that not only reshaped English religion but also set the stage for some of the most violent purges in English history. The Reformation Parliament backed Henry, and the machinery of state power was directed toward dismantling the influence of the Catholic Church in England. What followed was a series of acts and campaigns that involved executions, torture, and the total suppression of opposition. The first signs of Henry's turn toward brutality appeared in his treatment of former allies. Sir Thomas More, once a close friend and the Lord Chancellor, refused to recognize Henry as the head of the church. He was arrested, tried for treason, and executed in 1535. His beheading was a grim signal to all who dared resist. The Carthusian monks of the London Charterhouse also refused to submit to Henry's religious authority. Over the next few years, they were tortured, starved, and publicly executed in grotesque displays meant to strike fear into the hearts of other dissenters. This was only the beginning. The dissolution of the monasteries, which began in 1536, marked a significant escalation in the king's campaign against the Catholic Church. Under the guidance of Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, over 800 religious institutions were closed, and their vast wealth was seized by the crown. Monks, nuns, and abbots were turned out of their homes. Some were executed for resisting, others were hunted down like traitors. The countryside was littered with the remnants of centuries-old religious houses, their destruction accompanied by cruelty and grief. The economic and social devastation was immense, and the violence used to enforce these policies was ruthless. One of the most tragic responses to the king's policies came in the form of the Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536. This massive uprising in northern England brought together tens of thousands of peasants, nobles, and clergy who opposed the dissolution and the break from Rome. They marched under banners bearing the 5 wounds of Christ and demanded the restoration of the monasteries. At first, Henry appeared to negotiate. He promised pardons and reforms. But once the rebels dispersed, he ordered brutal retribution. Over 200 leaders were executed, including the respected lawyer Robert Aske. The executions were carried out with medieval cruelty. Men were hanged, drawn, and quartered, their remains displayed in public places as warnings. Henry VIII's use of terror was methodical and institutionalized. As his reign progressed, he systematically transformed the legal and religious structure of England into a weapon to silence dissent. The foundation of this machinery of fear was laid with the passing of the Treason Act of 1534, which effectively criminalized any opposition to the king's authority as supreme head of the church. The wording of the law was deliberately vague and broad. Mere refusal to acknowledge Henry's supremacy, even in private conversation, could be interpreted as treason. The line between disloyalty and disagreement disappeared. This ambiguity allowed Henry to arrest and execute subjects at will, giving him a cloak of legality over what was, in truth, a regime of fear and repression. Families lived in silence, afraid that an unguarded word might bring them under suspicion. The Tower of London, already a symbol of royal authority, now became the epicenter of a dark chapter in English history. Political prisoners, religious dissenters, and unfortunate victims of courtly intrigue were brought here, often never to emerge alive. Though torture was not widespread in English legal custom compared to continental Europe, under Henry's rule, exceptions were readily made. The rack, the manacles, and other grim devices were employed against those accused of treason or heresy. These tools of pain were often used not for confession, but for submission, to break the body and spirit. Executions became spectacles, designed to terrorize the populace and reinforce the message that the king's will was divine law. Many were hanged, drawn, and quartered, their limbs displayed across cities and townships, slowly rotting in the open air. Henry's persecution extended to both sides of the religious spectrum. On one hand, staunch Catholics who refused to accept the king's new religious order were branded as traitors. On the other hand, radical Protestants who wanted faster reform or criticized Henry's decisions were burned as heretics. This created an environment where no one could feel safe, neither the old order nor the new. The king's own whims dictated who lived and who died. In 1539, the Act of 6 Articles was passed, reaffirming certain traditional Catholic doctrines like transubstantiation and clerical celibacy. It resulted in the imprisonment, torture, and execution of many Protestants who had believed Henry was leading them toward true reform. The shifting religious policy ensured that everyone walked a perilous line, never knowing when belief would become betrayal. One of the most chilling episodes of Henry's religious tyranny was the fate of the Carthusian monks, a devout and peaceful order known for their silence and devotion. These men refused to take the oath recognizing Henry as head of the church. In response, they were dragged from their monasteries, chained to walls in the Tower of London, and left to starve. Some were hanged, others disemboweled while still alive. Their deaths were not merely punishment, they were messages carved in blood. And yet, their defiance became one of the most haunting symbols of spiritual resistance in Tudor England. The government even circulated written accounts of their executions to spread fear further. Henry's England was no longer a place of dialogue or debate, it had become a battlefield of survival. The king's use of Thomas Cromwell, his powerful chief minister, as the executor of these policies brought a cold efficiency to the Reign of Terror. Cromwell orchestrated many of the reforms that allowed Henry to centralize power and dismantle opposition. He was the architect of the dissolution of the monasteries, which not only destroyed religious life across England but also redistributed immense wealth to the crown and favored nobles. Cromwell used a spy network to report on suspicious behavior. Informants infiltrated homes, parishes, and noble courts. Anyone, from a noblewoman to a farmer, could be accused. Families were torn apart, reputations destroyed, estates seized. Cromwell's bureaucracy didn't just enforce laws, it created fear itself as a political instrument. Ironically, even the most loyal servants of Henry were not safe. Anne Boleyn, the very woman Henry had defied the Pope to marry, became a victim of his tyranny. When she failed to bear a male heir and became politically inconvenient, a plot was devised to rid Henry of her. Accused of adultery, incest, and high treason, Anne was arrested, tried in a court full of her enemies, and found guilty on flimsy evidence. In 1536, she was executed by a French swordsman specially brought in to deliver a clean beheading. Her fall marked the beginning of a series of orchestrated betrayals. Her brother, George Boleyn, and several courtiers were also executed, victims of palace politics and Henry's relentless desire to control both his lineage and his legend. The same fate awaited Thomas Cromwell himself. After years of loyal service, Cromwell arranged a marriage between Henry and Anne of Cleves in 1540, hoping to secure a Protestant alliance. But Henry was appalled by Anne's appearance and used the failed marriage as a pretext to destroy Cromwell. Arrested during a council meeting, Cromwell was charged with treason and heresy and executed within weeks. His fall from grace illustrated the chilling reality that in Henry's court, loyalty was temporary and power fleeting. No one, no matter how instrumental to the king's success, could escape his wrath once they became inconvenient. Henry's paranoia and ruthlessness increased with age. He grew bloated, ill, and increasingly suspicious of those around him. His fifth wife, Catherine Howard, was accused of infidelity and executed in 1542. Even whispers from her past were enough to seal her fate. Her final words, "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper," were said to haunt the halls of the palace. By this point, Henry had transformed from a charismatic Renaissance prince into a tyrant fueled by suspicion and bloodlust. His legacy was no longer defined by military triumphs or cultural achievements, but by gallows and execution blocks, by dungeons and fires that devoured the bodies of the condemned. The ordinary people of England suffered as much as the nobles. With the monasteries gone, many lost access to charity, education, and medical care. The economic disruptions led to unrest, food shortages, and inflation. The rich grew richer on the spoils of church lands, while the poor wandered in search of lost livelihoods. Uprisings like the Prayer Book Rebellion and Kett's Rebellion were rooted not just in theology, but in economic desperation and political disenfranchisement. Henry's England was no longer a realm ruled with consensus or noble idealism. It had become a monarchy of surveillance, fear, and divine right claimed at the edge of a sword. Henry also created a propaganda machine to control the narrative of his reign. Painters like Hans Holbein the Younger were commissioned to depict Henry as a majestic, powerful ruler. Chronicles were rewritten to portray his decisions as wise and God-ordained. Dissenting voices, historical or theological, were silenced through censorship or execution. Books were banned, sermons were regulated, and education was closely monitored. The printing press, once a tool of enlightenment, became a medium of control. The king's face adorned coins, tapestries, and the very walls of court. He sought not just obedience but reverence, a godlike status on earth. Those who resisted this myth were simply erased from the story or destroyed. In Henry's later years, his health deteriorated rapidly. He became grotesquely obese, his leg ulcerous and foul-smelling, his temper unpredictable and vicious. Yet even then, his power was absolute. He continued to execute those who displeased him, including elderly nobles like Henry Pole, Baron Montague, and Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury. Margaret's execution in 1541 was particularly horrifying. She was over 60 years old and dragged to the scaffold without a proper trial. The inexperienced executioner struck her multiple times before she finally died. It was not justice, nor even political necessity. It was the cruelty of a man who had grown addicted to power and blind to the humanity of his victims. By the time of Henry's death in 1547, England was a vastly different country from the one he inherited. The religious map had been redrawn, the aristocracy reshaped, and the common people cowed. His reign had unleashed a level of political and religious terror not seen before in English history. He had executed thousands, repressed millions, and left behind a legacy drenched in blood. And yet, he remains one of the most remembered monarchs of England, not because of his greatness, but because of the enduring scars his tyranny left behind. Henry VIII's reign was not merely about kingship. It was about how power, once unchecked, mutates into cruelty, and how one man's obsession with control can turn a kingdom into a graveyard. As the 1530s gave way to the 1540s, Henry VIII's rule took on an increasingly blood-soaked tone. The king, once seen as England's golden Renaissance prince, had now evolved, or perhaps devolved, into a monarch whose name struck terror in the hearts of his subjects. By this phase of his reign, executions had become more than acts of political necessity. They were spectacles of terror, tools of control, and often, expressions of personal vengeance. The entire judicial system bent to Henry's will. Legal hearings became mere formalities. Accusations equaled guilt, especially when they served the king's personal or political ends. England was no longer governed by law and counsel, but by mood, paranoia, and the twisted appetites of a tyrant surrounded by flatterers and spies. One of the darkest manifestations of Henry's brutality was the mass execution of religious dissidents and perceived traitors, often carried out in public squares to serve as horrifying lessons. At Smithfield, at Tyburn, and at Tower Hill, the condemned were burned at the stake, hanged until half dead, then disemboweled and quartered. Their severed limbs were dipped in tar and displayed on pikes above gates and bridges. These punishments were not reserved solely for high-profile figures. Ordinary men and women, too, met such grisly ends. Monks who resisted, peasants who protested, printers who published forbidden tracts, even midwives or local clergy caught in religious crossfire. The king's policies ensured that executions were no longer rare events. They were routine, calculated, and terrifyingly efficient. Henry's massacres extended into political purges that reshaped the upper echelons of power. Entire noble families were wiped out. The Poles, a powerful Catholic family, were accused of plotting against the king and were annihilated one by one. In 1539, Henry Pole and Henry Courtenay, both cousins of the king and Plantagenet descendants, were executed. Their relatives, including Margaret Pole, the elderly Countess of Salisbury, were hunted down. Her death in 1541 remains one of the most horrific royal executions in history. She was dragged to the scaffold, protesting her innocence, and hacked to death by an amateur headsman in front of a shocked crowd. No formal charges were ever proven against her. Her crime was being connected to royal blood and opposing the king's religious changes. Henry had begun to kill not just for power, but to erase any legacy other than his own. The extermination of the Pilgrimage of Grace rebels remained fresh in national memory. The 1536 uprising had been one of the largest in English history, yet Henry showed no mercy. After feigning negotiation and promising pardons, he unleashed a wave of executions across northern England. Entire towns were punished. The leaders were taken in chains to London and sentenced to death. Among them was Robert Aske, the noble lawyer who had pleaded for a peaceful resolution. His execution was intentionally slow and humiliating. Hung in chains and left to rot on the walls of York Castle, his body became a ghastly warning for those who questioned royal authority. The North remained traumatized for generations, its monasteries razed, its people impoverished, and its spirit broken. Perhaps most disturbingly, Henry began turning against women and children, driven by succession paranoia and courtly gossip. After executing Anne Boleyn, he had her daughter Elizabeth declared illegitimate. Later, when Catherine Howard, his fifth wife, was executed for alleged adultery, her young female attendants, some barely in their teens, were also arrested, interrogated under duress, and some imprisoned for years. Fear crept into the royal nursery. Henry's own daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, were alternately declared bastards, restored to succession, then again placed in dangerous political limbo depending on the king's mood. The court became a maze of betrayal, suspicion, and hidden alliances. Nobody knew where the axe would fall next. Henry's religious terror continued to claim victims across both Catholic and Protestant lines. In 1540 alone, 3 prominent Catholics and 3 prominent Protestants were executed on the same day at Smithfield. The message was clear. Loyalty was not to God, nor to doctrine, but to Henry alone. Priests were burned alive while reformers were hanged beside them. A nation was confused and terrified. Clergy preached sermons that contradicted previous teachings. Those who tried to interpret the king's religious policies were taking their lives into their hands. Henry's God was mutable, unpredictable, and wore a crown. The king had essentially deified himself, and any challenge to his divine status was punishable by death. One of the most grotesque aspects of Henry's reign was the execution of entire communities. In the north, after the failure of further rebellions against the crown's suppression of Catholicism, entire villages were burned. In some cases, hundreds were executed by the sword, especially in Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. Local leaders were tortured for information, and hangings were held in marketplaces. The rural nobility, who had once mediated between crown and peasant, were now extinct or disempowered. The monarchy's direct hand now stretched into every corner of the kingdom. With the help of Cromwell's bureaucracy, local records were combed for signs of resistance. People were punished for failing to report neighbors. It was a world where silence was seen as betrayal and loyalty had to be constantly proven. Henry's court became a theater of paranoia, even among those closest to him. He demanded constant displays of obedience. Counselors knelt for hours, scribes reworded entire laws to reflect his whims, and foreign ambassadors were warned not to speak ill of his policies. Spies reported on jesters' jokes, on dinner table conversations, on the glances exchanged between courtiers. The mere suspicion of disloyalty could result in arrest. As the king aged and his body failed him, his mental state also began to decay. He became increasingly paranoid, issuing orders in the dead of night, demanding confessions from innocent men, and testing the loyalty of his own family. His illness, likely caused by type 2 diabetes, open leg ulcers, and psychological decline, did not reduce his cruelty, it intensified it. The cruelty wasn't limited to people. Henry's destruction of England's cultural heritage is still felt today. During the dissolution of the monasteries, priceless libraries were burned, illuminated manuscripts destroyed, religious art vandalized. Tapestries and sculptures crafted over generations were tossed aside or sold for scrap. Thousands of monks and nuns, dedicated to spiritual life, were evicted. Their roles in education, medicine, and charity were not replaced. The cultural loss was incalculable. It was not just people who were massacred, it was memory itself. Henry's vision of England was purged of anything that reminded him of an independent church or any higher moral authority. In destroying the past, he tried to become the author of the future. Even Henry's own sons and heirs were not safe from the storm of his decisions. His only legitimate son, Edward VI, inherited a kingdom that was politically unstable and religiously fragmented. Though Henry tried to secure the succession through acts of parliament and a detailed will, the bloodletting he had unleashed left Edward surrounded by factions, many of whom would go on to imprison, execute, or betray one another. His daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, would each ascend the throne amid the ruins of their father's legacy, forced to rebuild and redefine the nation he had torn apart. Henry had not secured a dynasty, he had forged a kingdom of trauma. In the last year of his life, Henry ordered one final massacre, a list of arrests and executions that included nobles, clergy, and scholars. Even as his body was failing, the king's thirst for control had not diminished. From his bed in Whitehall Palace, he continued to sign death warrants. In 1546, the radical Protestant Anne Boleyn, who had been tortured in the Tower on the Rack, was burned at the stake. Her crime, refusing to recant her belief in salvation by faith alone. Her courage in the face of such pain was a stark contrast to the king's increasingly cowardly and reclusive manner. Boleyn died with her spine broken and body torn, yet her words lived on. She represented the many who chose faith or principle over obedience to tyranny. Henry VIII died in January 1547, swollen, festering, and reviled by many. Yet even in death, his legend endured. His funeral was a grand affair, designed not to mourn, but to glorify. Yet the trail of corpses he left behind cast long shadows. Thousands had died under his orders. Entire communities were dismantled. Religious identity had been weaponized. And the English monarchy had been transformed from a feudal institution into an authoritarian state. Henry's legacy was not the flourishing of Renaissance culture or the glory of an empire. It was blood, betrayal, and fear. The death of Henry VIII in January 1547 marked the end of one of the most violent and transformative reigns in English history. Yet his legacy of brutality did not perish with him. Instead, it left a scar upon the land, shaping the monarchy, religion, and national identity for centuries. Henry's kingdom was not a land of peace or unity upon his death. It was a realm soaked in blood, stripped of its ancient institutions, and ruled by fear. What followed was not healing, but confusion. His son, Edward VI, only 9 years old at the time of Henry's death, inherited not a crown of glory, but a throne buried under political corpses and religious ashes. Edward's reign was controlled by regents who battled for influence, using Henry's repressive laws as weapons against each other. Religious policies flipped once again, this time further towards Protestantism. Churches were stripped of images, Latin masses abolished, and old traditions condemned. But the people, exhausted and fearful, had no strength left to resist. The older generation still remembered the monks burned and the abbots hanged. Henry's machinery of suppression had not vanished, it had simply changed hands. Public executions continued. Heresy trials resumed. The shadow of the father still loomed over the son. The seeds of terror that Henry planted continued to bear poisoned fruit. When Edward died in 1553, his sister Mary I took the throne. A devout Catholic, she sought to reverse the changes her father had made, but instead of reconciliation, she chose vengeance. The Protestant persecutions under her rule, particularly the burning of over 280 reformers including Cranmer, Latimer, and Ridley, earned her the title, Bloody Mary. Yet it is crucial to understand that her actions were not in isolation, they were a mirror of the precedent Henry had set. Mary inherited a kingdom where executing dissenters had become normalized. Her father had paved the way for tyranny cloaked in piety. The burnings of Smithfield were a continuation of the flames Henry had first ignited. When Elizabeth I assumed the throne in 1558, she was determined to stabilize a fractured nation. She pursued a more moderate religious path, but she, too, wielded the crown's power with deadly force when needed. The recusancy laws punished Catholics, and secret executions of perceived threats continued. The Tower of London, which had echoed with the screams of Henry's victims, remained a symbol of fear. Elizabeth may have worn a more restrained mask, but the iron fist behind it was forged by her father. The culture of surveillance, betrayal, and propaganda lived on, institutionalized in the very core of English governance. Perhaps one of the most lasting effects of Henry's massacres was the complete destruction of the Catholic monastic system in England. Before Henry, the monasteries had served as centers of learning, charity, and spiritual life. Their libraries contained some of the oldest texts in Europe. Their lands supported the poor, the sick, and travelers. After the dissolution, these lands were sold off, often to the highest bidder among Henry's favorites. Wealth became concentrated in the hands of a new elite, loyal to the crown but indifferent to the needs of the people. The social safety nets were shattered. The sick and the elderly, once cared for by monastic hospitals, now roamed the roads, begging or dying in ditches. Henry had replaced faith with coin, compassion with compliance. The economic devastation was just as severe. The sudden influx of land and wealth into private hands created enormous inflation. Prices soared, wages stagnated, and poverty spread like plague. The crown was rich, but the country was poor. The middle class shrank, and rural communities were gutted. Where monasteries once provided employment and stability, now there were only ruins and silence. Rebellions erupted in various counties, small, sporadic, and quickly crushed, but they reflected the deep wounds inflicted by Henry's policies. In place of spiritual tradition and communal life, the people were left with fear, famine, and the gallows. Culturally, England experienced a rupture with its medieval identity. The destruction of Catholic art, music, literature, and architecture created a void. Generations grew up without knowledge of their historical religious past. The Protestant identity imposed in the vacuum was less organic than authoritarian. It was enforced through censorship, government-controlled sermons, and rigid schooling. Those who dared to look back, who remembered the chants, the saints, the images, were branded traitors. Henry had not just executed bodies, he had executed memory. The English Reformation under his rule was not born in debate or dialogue but in dungeons and on scaffolds. The trauma of Henry's reign also changed the very nature of monarchy in England. Before him, kings were seen as servants of divine order, limited by custom and counsel. After him, they became instruments of divine right, their word supreme. Parliament, once a partner in governance, had become a rubber stamp. Laws were passed retroactively to justify executions. The idea that opposition to the king was equivalent to opposition to God took root. This dangerous ideology would persist into the Stuart period, leading to future tyrannies, and eventually to the English Civil War itself. In many ways, Henry's thirst for total control set the stage for future royal bloodshed. And yet, the man himself has often been remembered with a disturbing degree of admiration. Portraits show a confident, majestic ruler. Textbooks describe his reign as transformative, even progressive. The 6 wives, the Church of England, the Navy, these achievements are often emphasized over the bodies left behind. But for the thousands who died under his laws, Henry was not a hero. He was an executioner in a crown. A man who sent friends, wives, monks, rebels, and children to their deaths. The mass graves of the dissolution, the gallows of the north, the torture chambers of the Tower, they are the true monuments of his reign. Even today, the legacy of Henry VIII's brutality lives on in the ruins scattered across the English countryside, the shattered abbeys of Glastonbury, Fountains, and Rievaulx. In the blood-stained stones of Smithfield, where martyrs burned. In the Tower, where traitors prayed. And in the quiet villages where families once found shelter in monasteries now lost to time and greed. These are not just relics, they are echoes. Echoes of a time when power consumed the soul of a king and dragged a nation through hell. In the end, Henry VIII got what he wanted: absolute control, a restructured church, and a dynasty. But he did not get peace. His children inherited a broken country. His name became a synonym for tyranny. And history, though often tempted to romanticize him, cannot escape the truth that Henry VIII ruled not with wisdom, but with fire and steel, silence and fear. He was not a reformer. He was a butcher in royal robes. You've just witnessed one of the darkest punishments in history. But many more still lurk in the shadows. So if you dare, subscribe to Torture Vault, where every scream from the past still echoes.